Hi, my name is Scott the Miniature Maniac, and today we crack open the insanely anticipated paint range from Games Workshop, Contrast Paints. What up, mini family? Unless you've been living under a rock or you're a normal person and you happen to stumble upon this video, the hobby world has been struck with another case of GW fever. Seriously, everywhere I look, it's contrast paints. Just gonna make myself some lunch here. I think it's time for a little chow. For a little nap. GW sent me the entire range of contrast paints to review, but are in no way affecting my opinion of the product. Contrast paints are Games Workshop's way of combating the legions of gray, unpainted armies we see in our hobby today. And at first, that may sound like a really heartwarming incentive, but we look at how GW has been handling their PR campaign, a different story starts to arise. Not yet, Scott! The paint range is designed to go over a light undercoat and provide you with a finished portion of the miniature in one coat of paint. You get all the contrast you need in one coat. Sounds magical. Now, you may be saying to yourself, Scott, you're not fit to review this product. You're not the target audience of this paint range. And while you are correct, I am a painting god. You bring up a good point. So I called in my friend Mark to come and test drive the new paints for me.
Hi, I'm Mark.
Mark is a novice painter. The model that he painted here in this test was his third or fourth model ever. We started out the evening by watching GW's videos on how to use the product. And then, with a GW model, a GW miniature holder, GW contrast paints, and hell, even GW palette paper, I set Mark loose with the goal of trying to paint this Stormcast Eternal as close to the box art as he could. Something I noticed while Mark was painting was, despite watching the video, he assumed the paint was conventional and that it should be getting even flat coats as opposed to being a wash, which I reminded him it was okay if each layer wasn't fully opaque. We also noticed that the blue he picked was very glossy, upon which I told him to shake each pot before use, and that seemed to resolve the issue. He painted the model in approximately 1 hour and 45 minutes, and then I asked him some questions.
These contrast paints are very thin, which I'm not sure if that's just because previously I didn't thin my paints enough, but it was very much like a wash. Beyond that, I was not able to be as detail focused as I wanted to be. So there were some places that I wanted to do very small pieces of color, like the rivets on his armor, and I was not able to achieve that with such a thin, runny paint. There were some things that came out really smoothly. A lot still looks very watercolory, but it also did create shading while applying the color. So it was effective in saving that step, though maybe at a cost.
All right, up until this point, I have not even used the contrast paints yet, so it's time for me to get my hands on them. I painted a very similar model as Mark, but I picked slightly different colors while still following the idea of one coat of paint. From this initial test, it seemed like a heavily pigmented wash and with more variety of tones than Games Workshop's shade range. Instead of just dark colors, there are actually some lighter colors too. So my approach was really to slop it on. It's weird. Usually I don't have to care about being accurate when applying a wash because I'm applying it all over the model. But with contrast paints, it seems like you want to get the paint to settle in the recesses like a wash, but you also don't want it to get onto other parts of the model because that would affect the undercoat for other contrast paints. Your brush doesn't have a whole lot of accuracy when it's full of paint, but the paints also don't sink into the recesses if you're applying a small amount. I struggled with this. Essentially, I found myself having to reapply the undercoat a lot. The undercoat is the whole reason this system works, so I figured I should really keep it intact. This is the result I got painting for the same amount of time as Mark with all the same products following Games Workshop's recommendation for how to use the product. He's painted 4 minis, I've painted hundreds. Here's my initial observation. The cream colored cloth looks great as you would expect it to with a light brown wash over a color that's already cream. The blue and black look okay, and the faux metallics are pretty bad. I don't think this paint is a replacement for metallics in my paint range, but maybe it is for you. Something else I realized while painting this miniature is that contrast paints don't work the greatest on smooth, flat surfaces, and they'd be more suited for a model with some more texture. Perhaps this is the reason we see a lot of demos of the product being used on plague bearers. Alright, so let's toss them a softball then. Let's paint these fun models from The Other's 7 Deadly Sins, a game from Cool Mini or Not, also while testing some fun things. First and foremost, let's just test contrast paint straight up. I decided to go for a blue monster, so I tried out Leviathan Blue. This color is a little more opaque than expected. The wash effect isn't coming through as good as I would hope. With a less opaque wash, it would look a lot better. Splash a little blood on, paint his eyes, and clean up his base, and this is the effect that I got in under 20 minutes using 2 different contrast paints. Alright, now what happens when we use the same scheme, but instead of using contrast paints, we use GW's shades? Well, the colors are less intense for sure, but it kind of works the same way, so this inspired my third test. Is it possible to make your own contrast paints by mixing Games Workshop normal paint with GW shades? So I gave that a shot. I mixed Drakenhof Nightshade with Regal Blue and Reichland Flesh Shade with Dark Flesh in a 1-to-1 ratio. The mixture handled very similar to contrast paint, but the result is a little bit different, but closer than our last trial. Pretty interesting. Next, I wanted to see what you could accomplish by taking a little bit more time to develop the highlight on the miniature. I applied the paint as normal, but then mixed each respective contrast paint with Gray Sear, a light gray color supplied with the range. I used this color to get a highlight. It's important to note that in this case, and every case you see online when someone adds extra highlights to the contrast paint, the real work isn't being done by the contrast paints. It's being done by the normal acrylic paint, which in this case is Gray Sear, and also the knowledge of the respective painter as to where to put the highlights. With 10 more minutes of work, I'm able to get a pretty good improvement. Next, I wanted to see if a zenithal undercoat affected them at all in a positive way, so I painted up 2 monsters, one with just Gray Sear as an undercoat, and another with a zenithal undercoat. One observation about the zenithally undercoated model was that the wash was collecting in areas like under the tongue, and it was just as intense as it was on top of the tongue. So it looked kind of strange. You would expect the color to get less intense as it goes further into shadow like it does on the flatter areas of the tongue. Okay, so maybe the key is to apply the contrast paint with an airbrush over a zenithal undercoat to really take advantage of the undercoat. Which was my next test. With this test, I realized that while they do airbrush just fine, they operate no different than airbrushing a GW shade or an ink or a glaze, and in fact, I feel like we're not really taking advantage of the real benefit of contrast paint, which is that they should be washed on, revealing all of the details on the model while still being translucent on the highlight. An airbrush's real value is how smoothly it can apply paint, not necessarily soaking the object in it, although you can also do that with an airbrush. Alright, for my final test, I wanted to test my typical speed painting routine, which is basically following the rule of the closer an item on the model is to the face, the more highlights, love, and attention it gets. Also, typically, I'm not washing the paint on, I'm applying it more like a glaze, but in this case, I did wash it on to once again use the product as it was intended. I timed my last speed paint at 1 hour and 45 minutes. Let's see if I can beat that. Done in 1 hour and 12 minutes, so I definitely beat it, but is the result better? A problem that I'm discovering I'm having is that the line is inconsistent in opacity. What I mean by that is some paints like Leviathan Blue, Flesh Terror Red, or Cygor Brown cover over the undercoat a lot more opaquely than Magos Purple, Agueros Dunes, Basilicanum Gray, etc. It's not like, oh, it's yellow, it won't cover as well. Some colors that you might expect to be dark like purple are translucent. So what ends up happening is you get a very pastel looking model with less depth of color with certain spots that have more intense coverage. There's a learning curve to this product, and what I thought I'd do to help myself out a little bit was make a little chart of the contrast paint, doing 2 types of application. One where it's pooling in the recess and one where it's applied more thinly. So we get an idea for the range of tones that that particular contrast paint could be. A picture of this chart is linked in the description if you should need it. Alright, so I've done a lot of tests and I have a lot of thoughts, and hopefully I can boil them down into something coherent for you to take away. When it comes down to it, this is the result you can get with a typical GW figure following their instructions for how to use contrast paints. You might get a slightly better or slightly worse result depending on what colors you use and what figure you're painting, but this is the average. This model has a nice mixture of different materials that you find across all the models you're painting. If you think this looks good for approximately 1 hour and 30 minutes of painting and you want the majority of your army to look like this, then this range is for you. It's also worth mentioning that while you may think this individual model doesn't look that great, models in units tend to look a lot better. So take this one Stormcast Eternal and put them in a unit of 5 or 10. It really will change your opinion of what you think is a good quality paint job. I think there's a time and place for contrast paints. For me personally, a lot of the more translucent colors are basically just a wash, and I will use them like that. But a lot of the more opaque colors, which are Leviathan Blue, Ultramarine Blue, Dark Angels Green, Flesh Terror Red, Shyish Purple, Cygor Brown, Wildwood, Snakebite Leather, and Black Templar are a little bit more interesting. In my speed painting video, I described the base coating process like this. What we'll do is base coat them now, but with a thinner consistency that we're used to for base coating. You want to shoot for a paint that's so thin that it doesn't streak when you paint with it, but it's also still translucent. We need it to be translucent so that it shows the light values we airbrushed on below. Now honestly, the hardest part of that speed painting process is nailing the right consistency, getting the paint to the point where it's not streaking, but it's also still translucent. Maybe these more opaque contrast paints could just be the right consistency right out of the pot. I almost wish that they were all just that opaque and then I could thin them to my desired consistency. But again, I'm not the target audience. In the end, this is not a ground-shaking product, and it slots nicely into Games Workshop's product line with some overlap, which tends to happen when GW releases new paint stuff. I'll probably continue to use the product and still test different things with them, and who knows, maybe on amorphous style models like this, I'll still use them exclusively. But when I invest a little bit of extra time and use a normal paint range in a model, I think I like the result enough to be willing to spend that extra time on the model. But that's me. I'm different than you, and I'd love to hear your opinion for whether this effect is good enough to replace your entire paint range or whether it's more of a mixture. Now, there's one last thing that I alluded to earlier in this video that I want to address. Contrast paint kind of started with one foot in the grave in my book. And that's because of the community's perception of this product as being a magical product. And I don't know if that's because of the rabid GW fanboyism that exists in our hobby today, or because of GW's PR route they decided to take via having pro painters say nice things about the product line, or by labeling it as revolutionary. But I kind of abhor products that label themselves as amazing or magical or revolutionary, when in actuality the truth is far more complicated than that. Dishonesty in this budding marketplace of miniature painting kind of upsets me. And it upsets me because the buyers are my mini family and they're not being given the full story. So while GW's plight to want to eradicate all gray armies seems like a noble one, and it is indeed a noble one, it also kind of seems like they're trying to sell to people that buy into the idea that you can paint better with no time and skill invested if you own this specific product. But at the same time, they demonstrated the product in its full glory on their YouTube channel to show people exactly what you could do with it. So maybe it's a little bit of a gray area. Well, that's gonna do it for this one, guys. If you like this style of video, I have other videos like this one that you can find linked in the top right-hand corner of the screen. If you like the channel and you want to support it, there are a bunch of links in the description that enable you to do that, namely a Patreon campaign with a bunch of fun rewards, like a Discord server where you and I can hang out any day of the week and talk about your mini painting projects or your favorite flavor of paint. Also down there, you'll find links to my recommended hobby gear, my Amazon shopping link that you can use while shopping on Amazon, merch, and all the stuff like that. Subscribe or die! And most importantly, don't forget to paint more minis!